Hello, I'm Laura Mackenzie. I'm the clinical team manager and a mental health nurse in the Oxfordshire CAMHS Neurodevelopmental Conditions Pathway. In this presentation, we're going to think together about a very sensitive, difficult but important subject, and that is self-harm. Before we start, I just wanted to acknowledge that thinking about self-harm can be really difficult for people. It can bring up challenging thoughts and feelings in ourselves. So please do take care of yourself whilst listening to this presentation. Please do stop, pause, turn off the video, come back to it, whatever is going to be helpful for you whilst we think about this topic together. So self-harm is no longer the secret it once was, and it's talked about much more often in popular culture, such as social media, films, TVs, and in music. This lyric reminds us that there's always a reason for someone to self-harm, and we'll be considering potential reasons why children and young people self-harm during this presentation. Our aims in the session are to consider the impacts of self-harm, demonstrate how we can understand it, and to give you some practical ideas about how to help. The outline of this presentation is thinking about what is self-harm and what is it like for young people who self-harm and what is it like for their parents, your vision and goals, understanding self-harm, the relationship between self-harm and suicidality, thinking about adult-focused strategies and child-focused strategies. So the definition for self-harm is quite clear. We're thinking about a person who is deliberately hurting themselves physically, and often these can be through behaviours such as cutting, hitting, scratching, and poisoning oneself by taking overdoses, that kind of thing. The National Autistic Society go a step further in their definition to think about the particular link for autistic people and self-harm. And they say that self-harm is when somebody intentionally damages or injures their body. It's usually a way of coping with or expressing overwhelming emotional distress. Some autistic people may self-harm as a response to anxiety, stress, or because they find it very difficult to communicate their feelings. And this is certainly something that I've experienced when I'm working clinically with young people, that it's very often linked to their difficulty in communicating and understanding their emotions. Another definition of self-harm can be self-injurious behaviour, and that's a slightly different behaviour to self-harm. When we talk about self-injurious behaviour, we're thinking about any behaviour that results in someone hurting themselves physically, but it might not be deliberate. For example, it might be things like head banging, biting of the skin, picking skin around their nails, pulling off their toenails, that kind of thing. We use the term self-harm in this presentation to cover both deliberate self-harm and self-injurious behaviour, so that we're thinking about any action where a young person engages in that hurts themselves physically. When we're thinking about the impacts of self-harm, we have to acknowledge that strong feelings such as anxiety or low mood often drive the self-harm. And then the self-harm can lead on to strong feelings such as regret, guilt, shame, and confusion. And some people also feel trapped by self-harm as they see it as the only way that they can cope with stressful experiences and strong feelings or emotional dysregulation. The trouble with self-harm is that very often it stops other people from thinking about and understanding the underlying emotions, as you're understandably in that moment focused on the risk and the physical harm that that person's putting themselves through. I want to acknowledge how incredibly frightening and overwhelming it can be for an adult when a young child or a young person, particularly if it's your own young person, is self-harming. Especially if that young person also then communicates that they don't want to be alive. We'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between self-harm and suicidality in a later slide. It's also important to know that managing our own emotions as the adult is a key to supporting children who self-harm. Again, I'm going to speak about this later in the presentation. Please pause the video and spend some time thinking about what you want for the young person you're thinking about, and also for you. If you're able to, try to imagine them managing in a situation that they currently struggle in. Try to make sure that your goals are SMART. That's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. Press play again when you're ready to move on. So now we're going to move on to thinking about understanding what self-harm is. So the first thing I want to say is that if your child is on the waiting list for a neurodevelopmental assessment for autism and or ADHD, it is highly likely that they will be autistic and or have ADHD. Particularly for our service in Oxfordshire, we have a really robust screening process. So it's highly, highly likely that if a young person's on our waiting list, they will receive one or both of those diagnoses. When we're thinking about self-harm, the research tells us that autistic young people and those young people with ADHD are at an increased risk of self-harm. Now we're going to think a little bit about the functions of self-harm. So it's important to keep in mind that even though it might not seem like it, self-harm always has a function or a purpose. We know that people don't keep doing things unless it does something for them. And the thing about the functions of self-harm is that they can be very varied and they could change. But here are some ideas to get you thinking. So it might be to manage distress or to manage emotional dysregulation. Remember the story of emotion that you talked about in the emotional regulation video? It can be linked to that. Self-harm can be a way to escape demands or uncomfortable sensory experiences. It can be to feel something that could be good or bad. And I think that, within that, there might be a sensory component as well, particularly if you've got a young person who's got strong sensory sensitivities, they might use self-harm to get some sensory feedback or to shut down some sensory experiences. It can be to punish oneself, to gain help or support, either with the act of self-harm. So if they've cut themselves, somebody attending to their wound, looking after them, or it might be to try and get help or support for the underlying distress or emotion. Or it can be to gain access to something that a person wants or needs. Now we're going to think about the link between self-harm and suicidality. It's really, really important to say that most young people who self-harm are not trying to kill themselves. It's a very different and separate behaviour that, as we've just mentioned, has particular functions for people. However, we must think about self-harm seriously because young people who do self-harm are more likely to experience suicidal thoughts, and they then might make plans and take attempts to end their own life, or they might accidentally end their own life through their self-harming behaviour, so accidentally cutting a lot deeper than they intended to, and that being fatal. Again, it's important to know that not everyone who experiences suicidal thoughts do make plans or take attempts to make their own life. So there are very distinct stages around suicidality, just like there is with self-harm. When we're thinking about the risks related to self-harm and suicidality, it's really important to think about the questions that we use to make judgments around the risk. And here are some examples of some really good questions that we use within our clinical setting, but I'd encourage parents and schools to use as well. So first thing we think about is the self-harm superficial? So in our minds, superficial means non-life threatening. So we would be talking about light scratches or cuts that maybe need just a little bit of attention at home, a plaster, a bit of cleaning, or are they more severe and therefore needing medical attention? And how often is that behaviour happening? Does this young person have ongoing thoughts about ending their own life? And as we just said, having thoughts is one thing. The next stage to that is thinking, do they have plans to end their own life? And do they have means on acting on those plans? So they're the kind of 3 stages when we're thinking about this particular question. Have they got thoughts? Do they have specific plans? Do they have the means to act on those plans? Another question is, have they ever acted on these thoughts before? Again, previous history might be an indicator of risk. So if they've had suicidal thoughts before and acted on them, their risk would be higher. Whereas if they've had lots of thoughts before but not acted on them, then the risk might be lower. If the young person's communicating that they want to die or they don't want to be alive anymore, when are they doing this? So the timing of this communication can be really important. For example, does it happen all of the time, regardless of their emotional state? So when they're happy, when they're calm, when they're sad, when they're angry, or is it at times when they are highly aroused or distressed? And is there a general sense for them that life's not worth living? Or again, is it linked to specific times? So following an argument, for example. How long have they had these thoughts for? Is it something new? Is it more long term? Again, these are things we think about with risk. And finally, we think about what support is in place for them at home and at school. And is that enough to keep them safe in relation to the level of risk there is for them? So we can see that kind of assessing and managing risk can be complicated and multifaceted. And I guess what I would say is if you're concerned that your child is engaging in serious self-harm or that they're suicidal, please do make contact with either the NDC duty team or another CAMS team if your child is also open to them whilst waiting to see us, so that you can get advice and a clinician can think through these risk factors with you. What I would say is when we're thinking about self-harm is that we try to take positive risks, and we're going to think a little bit more about that as we move into the strategies. So thinking about adult focused strategies, initially we're going to think about those short-term goals. So what are the immediate or almost immediate things we're going to be doing to keep the young person safe if and when they're about to self-harm or they do self-harm? So the first thing is that we want to get in there and intervene and interrupt as early as we're able to. Remember that story of emotion that was discussed in that previous presentation. So trying to get in there to help them stop that behaviour is going to be really important. Being able to subtly remove any potentially harmful items out of that young person's reach, if you can, and if it's possible and safe to do so, is really important. For ourselves as the adult, trying to remember to respond wisely. So slowing down, taking a step back and trying to keep calm. This is easier said than done when you've got a young person in front of you, potentially your child, who's hurt themselves on purpose. Keeping calm can be really difficult. But like we said, this is one of the key aspects of managing that behaviour is our response. And if we can keep calm, it can make a huge difference. And remembering this sleep acronym. So stop, slow down, listen to what your young person is saying. Empathise with them. I can't stress enough the importance of empathy. Being able to validate that young person's experience, even if you don't agree with it, is really, really important because they know that you are hearing them and you are on their side and you are understanding. Validation is really important. Being able to explore and consider what the young person is saying. So what's the function of that self-harm? Is it about managing emotions or communicating something, or both those things? And then making a plan about what you're going to do, both individually and together. Further short-term goals will be around communicating with your young person that you are going to do whatever it takes to keep them safe. You are there for them. Now, that might be remaining with them until they feel that things have settled and the urge to self-harm has passed, or it might be giving them some space so they can let out some of that emotions. But them knowing that you are there for them is really important. If you're able to support your child into a safe physical space, preferably away from a place where they might usually self-harm, that can be helpful. Encourage and guide them towards a rewarding and ideally a soothing activity until that urge to self-harm has passed. So something that's going to help them regulate, bring their high emotional state down. If they're able to engage with that, or when they are, guiding them towards that can be really helpful. Sometimes modeling that to them can be useful. So they might not get involved straight away, but you're next to them doing that activity, whatever it might be. And basically being there with your young person to ride that wave of emotion and reminding them that high emotions pass. It won't last forever, even if it feels like it in the moment. Those strong emotions don't stay around forever, and it will start to feel different. So some longer term goals that we might think about as the adult is planning to remove things or minimize the reach of things that a young person might potentially use to hurt themselves. So we'll often do that on like a duty call, think with parents about them removing sharps or access to objects that they might use to hurt themselves, particularly if your young person is impulsively self-harming. So in that place where they have a strong emotion and they just do the self-harm to try and cope with it. So having things out of arm's reach so they can't just impulsively grab things can be really helpful. Over the longer term, again, developing your understanding of your young person's story of emotion and the function that their self-harm has. Is that function more about managing strong emotions? Is it about communicating their needs? Or is it a combination of both those things? And does it vary depending on what the self-harm is, what the situation has been? They're all things to keep in mind. Creating a safety plan with or for your young person. I always find it's really helpful, if at all possible, to have the young person involved in creating a safety plan, because then they're thinking about what they might actually be able to do when they're feeling really highly emotionally aroused or in crisis, as we might say. We're going to think a little bit more about that in a moment. Obviously, sometimes you can't do safety plans or other work directly with the young person for a variety of reasons, and that's absolutely fine too. Don't not do it because you can't, the young person won't engage. The final thing we really want to encourage you to think about in this section is about adaptation. So working towards addressing those underlying unmet needs, which might be adding into the reason why your young person is becoming overwhelmed and then self-harming. So that might be sensory issues, that might be difficulties at school, relational issues, they might not feel like they're getting the right support, those kinds of things. And we know that when we start to make adaptations in the environment for that young person, then the self-harming behaviour can lessen. What we're really trying to do is we're trying to help our young person learn how to effectively manage their emotions and to communicate what they need in a healthier, safer way. And that is going to take time to develop, and a lot of practice and a lot of positive reinforcement from us as parents and adults around this young person. We'll talk more about reinforcements, positive reinforcements and rewards in a moment. But it's really, really important that you keep practicing things. If you're trying out a new strategy, maybe do it in a low arousal environment first see how that goes. If the young person likes it, thinks it will be helpful, then you can try it when you're more in that crisis mode. And what we're doing is we're helping our young person build some skills and strategies to help them as they move into young adulthood and adulthood, so that they're more effectively able to manage these things as they become older. Just briefly mention about ABC charts. So these can be really helpful in objectively documenting challenging behaviour. So in this instance, we're thinking about self-harm. So we'd be really clearly thinking of examples of when and where the self-harm happened. What was it that they did? Do we know what those slow triggers were that were rumbling around in the background? What were the fast triggers that meant it happened then? What did the self-harm provide or achieve for the young person from their perspective? And what function did that self-harm have? So that might be our interpretation of what the self-harm function was at that point in time. And once we get a few of these, then we might start to see patterns and understand the function. And then we're much more able to think of alternatives and support the young person in a different way. So thinking about child-focused strategies. So we're splitting this into two sections. So this first section is around if the function of the self-harm is more about managing strong emotions, we're going to need to develop preventative strategies. So we want to practice these when you're not in a crisis state, and we want to be practicing them all the time, building them into everyday life so that they become a bit like a muscle memory, that when we start to feel a certain way, we're automatically going to try doing X, Y, or Z to manage our feelings in a different way. So firstly, we're going to want to identify what the young person's window of tolerance or their calm zone is. So that is when they feel calm, when they feel safe and they can think clearly, they can calm themselves, soothe themselves, and they're managing their emotions relatively okay, based on their developmental age. Obviously, younger children will find that more difficult than older children in typically developing young people. And we know that neurodiverse young people don't develop in the same way as their peer group. But we know that all children will have that time and space when they're feeling more settled, more calm. At that point, that's when you want to try and work with your child to develop and help them understand their story of emotion so that they can have start to develop some insight into what happens for them emotionally. And also, these are the times when we want to help develop their emotional toolbox, which you've talked about more in the emotional regulation presentation. And I have to say, this is one of the most helpful strategies that I use with young people clinically, is building an emotional toolbox with them. The thing that's really great about this is that the toolbox is split into different sections around kind of sensory tools and physical tools, people, special interests, and it highlights unhelpful tools that we use to manage emotions. And we can document them all in one place so that the young person eventually, and as adults supporting them, know where to go to find what can help. And we can support our young person to engage with those more helpful tools of managing. And in time, they will develop those skills more independently. It's great when you start doing a toolbox to pull on the things the young person already does. We all have ways that we manage emotions. They might not always be helpful, but we do. So identifying them already, because no one is starting from nowhere, and then building in and practicing new ways of managing emotions when you're not too highly aroused emotionally or cut off emotionally. You want to be in that kind of calm zone, window of tolerance space. Some additional strategies that might be helpful to include into the toolbox. And these go from kind of slightly easier to more difficult. So distraction, what are the things that a young person can use to distract themselves until the strong emotions passed or the urge to self-harm has passed. Using our senses to soothe ourselves. So can we engage our different senses with different things to help us soothe? So it might be smelling something that they love, having a weighted blanket on, or fiddling with something that they like the texture of, the touch of a favourite item of clothing or a hug, thinking about those different senses and thinking together with the young person, actually, what are those things that they really like from a sensory point of view. Having a positive activity every day and really paying attention to what that feels like, both individually for you and your young person, but also to each other. So when when I see my young person having joy, it makes me feel like this, that kind of thing. Opposite action. So this one can be really tricky, but really effective. So for example, if you're feeling really angry, talk quietly. If you're feeling really like sluggish, haven't got very much energy, jumping up and down, sometimes doing the opposite of what we feel can really help change our emotional state. Checking the facts. So that can be really helpful, particularly if you've got a young person who's quite kind of scientific in their thinking, but also for others, is really getting them to challenge some of those negative thoughts they might be having and trying to find the evidence for the opposite of those negative thoughts. So if they're feeling like worthless, nobody likes them, helping them find, well, what about your friend such and such? And your sister and your, those kinds of things can be really helpful. And finally, we're thinking about that acceptance. This can be really difficult to do, but really being able to accept that some things are outside of our control and that fighting to get control of them can make things more problematic. As I said, they became more difficult, but they're all helpful things to try, both for us as adults actually and for our young people. So if we go on to thinking about if the self-harm is more about communicating underlying needs rather than managing strong emotions, what we need to do is help that young person find alternative ways to communicate with us and to ensure that their needs will be met equally, if not more effectively, than when they communicate via self-harm. So firstly, we need to understand what the function of their self-harm is. And we'll do that by listening, by observing, and by completing some ABC charts. Once we understand what the function is, we're going to help our young person develop other ways to communicate with us. For example, it might be that you agree that your young person can use a keyword to express a certain need or want that they have, rather than engaging in a self-harming behaviour. Or it might be that you have a agreement that you'll WhatsApp or message each other that you need help or that you need space. Or that there's an agreement that your young person will go off to a separate room and scream really loudly when they're feeling overwhelmed. It's having those different strategies and having them really clearly agreed in that window of tolerance when you're not in a crisis. And bear in mind, it's highly likely that, at least to start with, you're going to need to reward your young person for using this alternative way of communicating. So you might need to be rewarding them all of the time. The reward is up to you and your young person, but giving them that reward, verbally praising them if that helps too, and that should be reduced once the alternative way of communicating is being used consistently by your young person. So once they've got the hang of it, basically, you can then reduce the need to reward them for that behaviour. So thinking about those crisis times, we really want to think about safety plans. As I said before, if you can do this with your young person, that's sometimes really helpful because they're engaged in it. They might be more likely to go along with it at the time of crisis, but it doesn't always work like that. So having a safety plan, even if it's for yourself, so you know what to do when your young person is really struggling and self-harming or potentially self-harming, it can just be really helpful. So we would think about, what are the triggers for the young person? What are the things we know are going to increase the likelihood that they're going to feel overwhelmed or need to communicate with us and want to self-harm? And what are those early warning signs that again indicate to us that that self-harm might be coming? Does their body language change? Does their voice change? Does their behaviour change? How might we tell that self-harm is coming? Within the safety plan, we'd also want to be thinking about coping strategies, which might include strategies from the emotional toolbox, but we might want to reframe them as a crisis kit or an emergency kit. Again, having a young person involved in naming it can be really helpful, but it's highly likely that this is going to be a much smaller, more specific set of strategies or tools that you can use when their emotions are really heightened and when they're feeling the urge to self-harm the strongest. And they're the things that are going to help your young person ride that wave of emotion. Those crisis kit tools were much more likely to be physical, sensory, or distraction based, that really visceral kind of ways of coping, rather than the talking or thinking based, because we know that when our emotions are high, it's very difficult for our brains to think in a logical, cognitive way. So it's going to be much more of that kind of physical, sensory stuff that we're thinking about for the crisis toolkit. Also in our safety plan, we're going to think about the key supports and contacts that a young person might have around them, and also what other people can do when that young person is struggling. Again, if you're able to get a sense from a young person what they find helpful when they're feeling really overwhelmed and putting that in. Some people like to be with others, like to be held. Other people just want space, and actually the thought of someone being next to them will make them feel even more emotional. So thinking with a young person about that's really helpful. And we just want to reiterate that keep using rewards around the different strategies your young person is trying out and using. If they're using preventative strategies or those in a crisis or anything in between, reward them, let them know that you see what they're doing, you value what they're doing, and keep doing that until those changes have been embedded. We know that parenting a young person who self-harms can feel very isolating and can feel very shaming. And I think this quote kind of sums up that that feeling when you realise you're not alone, that there are other parents who struggle in a way that you do. So I'll just let you take a moment to read this quote. Okay, so in summary, we've talked about how self-harm always has a function or a purpose, and that normally it might either be an attempt to manage strong emotions or a communication of an underlying need, or both of those things, and that those functions or purposes might change. We know that self-harm impacts both the young person and the people supporting that young person. We know that questions can help us make judgments around risk, particularly around the links between self-harm and suicidality. We thought about adult-focused strategies, such as the short-term ones around safety and de-escalation, and the long-term strategies around prevention. And we've also thought about some child-focused strategies and skills, such as emotional regulation skills, alternative ways of communication, and the importance of rewarding everything they do. We also talked about the importance of having a safety or a crisis plan. And again, that's something that you can share with other people who are involved with your young person, whether that be school or other family members. So again, everybody's having a consistent approach to how to manage this very challenging behaviour. What I'd like to ask you to do now, before your question and answer session, is for you to revisit your goals. Go back and have a little think about what you put at the start of the session that you wanted for yourself and your young person. Try and identify some things that you want to take from this session to actually implement and do. Practice them. It'd be really great if you've had a go at trying to do some of these things before the session, so then we can talk with you about what that's been like, if it's been helpful or not, what the challenges might have been. And please do make a note of any questions or comments that you have and bring them along to the session. Thank you. I'll just share now some resources with you that you can look at in your own time. That Calm Harm app can be really helpful for young people to use, as well as adults actually. It's really simple, straightforward and a safe app for young people to use independently. The National Autistic Society always has lots of really helpful guidance with that autistic framework. And you can see the Autistica websites on there as well as information from Young Minds. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you found this helpful.